The last part of the previous class was where I said that there are some sections in the letter of James which can be recognized as units, but others cannot be recognized as units. We move now to the question of authorship. The point is, who is the author of James? The Greek word, or in the Greek text, you will find the name Jakobos, which is translated into English as James. And so we need to ask, who is this James who wrote this letter? In the New Testament, there are 4 individuals who are named James. The first is James, son of Zebedee. He was one of the 12 disciples called by Jesus, identified in the gospel with his brother John, but he died in the year 44 CE, martyred by Herod, as we read a few days ago in the liturgy. The second is James, who is the son of Alphaeus. He is mentioned in the lists of the apostles and also possibly in Mark at the burial scene when the women are mentioned. James is called the younger or the lesser, possibly because he was younger in age. The third James mentioned in the New Testament is James, the father of Judas. This Judas, as the evangelists tell us, was not Judas Iscariot, but Judas is identified with Thaddeus, but he was fairly unknown. Besides this mention of the relationship, there is nothing else with him. In yesterday's gospel text for the Sunday liturgy, the people of the hometown of Jesus speak about who Jesus is. And besides calling him the carpenter, the son of Mary, they also identify his brothers. Now, of these brothers, 2 are consistent in all the text, that is, in the Gospel of John and also in the Gospel of Mark and Matthew, who was taken from Mark. So basically, the James here is the Lord's brother, and many of the Catholic writers speak about him not being the son of Mary, but the son of Mary's sister, and so in a way, a cousin of Jesus more than his blood brother. This James had a great prominence in the Jerusalem church, as is mentioned both in the Acts of the Apostles and in the letter of Paul to the Galatians. How do we identify the author from these 4 persons who are named James? The first point we notice is that the author of this letter gives a very simple self-designation, that is, does not talk about himself in any other way except being a servant of God and Jesus Christ. The fact that he does not make a claim to be of the family of Jesus, does not talk about the fact that he is related to Jesus, does not talk about his power as coming from Jesus, is an indication that it is James, the brother of the Lord. In the letter of Jude, what we read is that Jude identifies himself like James does as a servant of God and Jesus Christ. Jude does not have Jesus Christ, but Jude has added after servant of God that he is the brother of James. Now, when we read Mark chapter 6, verse 3, we realize that these 2 names are consistently mentioned by both Mark and Matthew. And we also notice that the others, that is called Joseph and Simon, are basically different. Simon is another common name in both of these texts, but Joseph is quite different in Matthew and in Mark. So James and Jude are consistently mentioned as brothers of Jesus, and Jude, in his letter, in the introduction to his letter, identifies himself as the brother of James. The other 3 named James were not so known in the Christian community, or as in the case of James the apostle, the disciple, he died fairly early. So most scholars today think that it is James, the brother of Jesus, though there are some who think it is also anonymous. The date. Now, the letter of James lacks any sign of the problems of pseudonymity. In the case of pseudonymity, when an author wants to show, for example, that he is one of those apostles, because as you know, the early church had very strict regulations for anything being accepted as apostolic. As a matter of fact, in the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 9, verse 1, because Paul had not been with Jesus, the historical Jesus, he had a lot of problems being accepted as an apostle. So in the 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 1, Paul is literally asking emphatically, am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus the Lord? So the quality or the qualification to be an apostle, one of the qualifications was that the person who claimed to be an apostle had to have had physical contact with the Lord. And so if the person did not have physical contact, that person could not be considered an apostle. And Paul had great difficulty, and that's why he asked the question. This author does not claim any kind of apostolic authorship. And so therefore, because that is the case, it seems that the letter is earlier. Now, you remember I talked about the parousia, the second coming of Jesus. This author does not really talk about why the parousia was delayed, because those challenges appeared much later. Already at the end of the first century, at the end of the second century, you realize, or the beginning of the second century, these are problems which are beginning. So therefore, the early church has got to make a case. Why is the Lord delaying and so on? We notice that in the later letters about the delay of the parousia. Here, James does not make a case for the delay of the parousia. He only talks as Jesus does in the eschatological discourses in the synoptic gospel about how one must prepare for the coming of the Lord, which can be at any time. So he is in a way very similar to the gospels who speak about the Lord coming at any time and being prepared for when the Lord comes. In this letter of James, we notice there are basically elders and teachers, the presbyteros and the didaskalos. There are no bishops, for example. There is no formal structure, for example, which came much later into the early church. This community seems to be a community which is dealing with each other face to face, as James mentioned in the solutions that he gives to the challenges which people have. He seems to indicate a face-to-face community, and so rather than a community which was highly evolved. And so it seems the highly evolved ecclesia or church came much later. So this letter seems to have been written earlier. As a matter of fact, in chapter 5, when James talks about oaths, let your yes be yes and your no be no, it seems to have been taken exactly from the Sermon on the Mount of Matthew, and also links up with the Spirit of Jesus. Many of the sayings which James has seems to indicate a very close proximity to the source Q, in which we find the sayings of Jesus which have been used in the synoptic gospels. And the letter of James finally contains a number of incidental details that could be taken as evidence that the letter originated in Palestine and surrounding Syria. It was written basically to a particular group in Dispersion there. Now, those who hold that James, the brother of the Lord, was the one who wrote the letter would give a date before 62, because James was martyred possibly in around 62 to 69. And so before 69, surely many of them give a date of 62 CE. And another reason why the earlier date is given is because there is a relationship between the teaching of James in chapter 2 and Paul's teaching on the same topic, as I said, as we understand it today. In the early church, we know that there was a challenge with accepting the letter of James, because those who interpreted chapter 2 thought that James was at contrast with Paul. He was disagreeing with Paul. However, when we realize that they are saying the same thing, then we can say that there is no challenge, there is no problem. So James is not writing after Paul, possibly at the same time as Paul was writing, and there is no conflict, we notice, with regard to the Gentile mission, which began much, much later. And so most scholars give a date of 62 for the letter, fairly early in the history of the early church. Those who accept, and so you notice that the authorship and the date will also determine the place. Those who say that James, the brother of the Lord, wrote the letter would give a place outside Palestine, and basically the crowd in Dispersion or the diaspora or the Christians who were in Dispersion would be those in Syria and also perhaps in the southern Asia Minor. There are many allusions in the letter which talk about the Palestinian weather, and so it seems to have been written very, very likely in Palestine. This structure is a structure by Douglas Moo, and it is a very elaborate structure, and in the exegesis, this is the structure which I will follow. So I request you to pay attention to the structure. If you have any questions about it, you might ask. The structure begins with an address and a greeting. James identifies himself. In other words, there is internal evidence that the letter was written by James, just as there is internal evidence that the letter was written by Peter and that the letter was written by Jude. But there is no internal evidence in the letters of John. John does not name himself in the three letters, refers to himself as an elder. So the internal evidence for James is that James' name is mentioned in the letter, in the address. The second part of the letter, which is the broad part, speaks about the trials of the Christian community and how the Christian community must respond. There are four parts in this second part, which I have labeled, titled A, B, C, and D. Trials are sent in order to make the Christian stronger. What is the meaning of wisdom? How must one pray? And how does faith show itself in action? Poverty and wealth are challenges for the letter, and James has some very harsh words for the rich, as even Jesus has in the Gospel of Mark chapter 10 verses 23 and 24, when he says very clearly that it is not possible for those who are controlled by their riches to enter the kingdom of God. In the Gospel of Luke chapter 16 verses 19 to 31, we read the story of Dives and Lazarus. As a matter of fact, the only parable in which a character is named is Dives and Lazarus. Dives is not a name, it's the Latin for rich. Lazarus means God helps. So the fact that Luke is the only one who has that in his gospel is an indication that the evangelists basically have got harsh words like James has for the rich, especially among the rich, those who do not share their wealth. What exactly is Christianity? While one might profess with one's lips that Jesus is God, James says even the demons profess that Jesus is God. So professing with the lips that Jesus is God is of no consequence if a person does not show it in action. And that's why James will ask his readers to be doers of the word. And he specifies very clearly what doing the word would mean, when in keeping with what the Old Testament prophets have said, to be concerned about the widow and the orphan. The widow and the orphan are metaphors, or must be seen as metaphors, for those who have no one to help them. The orphan is an individual who does not have parents. The widow is an individual who does not have male support. So they must be seen as metaphors. And this is what true religion, according to James, means in this particular section when he speaks about being doers of the word. True religion is to care for widows and orphans. One is a Christian only if one does not show partiality. It is very easy to be partial to the rich and to put the poor aside. As a matter of fact, very clearly, the Pharisee and the publican in the Gospel of Luke chapter 18 is an example of this. How the Pharisee would be showing off and going right in front and showing God who he is and what he has done, and the publican beating his breast, the Gentile beating his breast and standing far away. I mean the tax collector, not Gentile, but the tax collector beating his breast and standing far away and regarding himself as a sinner. So if one shows partiality to the rich because they have been dressed in finery, then one is not being a Christian in the true sense of the word. James chapter 2, verse 26 has a very strong statement when he says that any faith which does not show itself in action is a faith that is necros, or a faith that is dead. The origin of dissensions within the community are a variety of origins. So, for example, the tongue can be that instrument which creates challenges in community, which creates problems in community, because people can bless and people can curse with the same tongue. And so therefore, in the first 12 verses of chapter 3, James speaks about how an uncontrolled tongue can be very, very harmful. And then there is, as I said, there are some sections which are more units. True wisdom is introduced by James here, which does not seem to fit in with what he has said, though you can connect it by talking about a person must be wise in the use of the tongue. However, in the next section, he speaks about this desire. A person who wants something, who will do anything because those desires are unbridled. In the earlier verses, it was the tongue which was unbridled. Now, it is desire which is unbridled. And this desire which is unbridled can lead to a number of complications. And that's why he invites his hearers, his readers, to repentance. And finally, a prohibition of critical speech, once again summing up or summarizing what he said in the beginning of chapter 3 with regard to the use or the maluse of the tongue. The fifth part of the letter, which is the penultimate part, is the implications of how the Christian would view the world. How must you, as a Christian, as a believer in Jesus, as a follower of the Lord, how must you view the world? And the first part of the 3 is a condemnation of arrogance. Those who, like the rich fool in Luke chapter 14, want to build big barns because they want to prepare for the future, that is arrogance. What you need to do is you need to recognize your human frail nature. You might remember I said to you that this pandemic has taught us a number of lessons. James is speaking to us in these verses, even in this pandemic, which has happened 2,000 years after the letter was written. Many of us, till last February, 2020 February, were making plans for 2023. And believe me when I say I had plans for retreats in 2023 and 2024. So we make our plans. However, James says in these verses, while you might make your plans, you need to keep in mind that you are like the wisp. You are here today and gone tomorrow like a cloud. You are like no one, you are nothing. Keep that point in mind, so none of us can afford to be arrogant. During these days and months, my friends, Many of you, if not all of you, or most of you, would know of someone who was in good health, keeping very strong, following all the rules of life. And that person was struck with COVID, tested positive, and sometimes in a matter of hours, sometimes in a matter of days, the person has gone to the Lord. That is how fragile James says our lives are. And that is why we cannot afford to be arrogant about anything. No matter how strong we think we are, no matter how intellectual we think we are, no matter how smart we think we are, we must keep in mind that our arrogance leads to our downfall. Wealth is given, James says, for a reason. So it is true that you have earned and you have done a good job, and fair enough, you need to enjoy. But you need to enjoy not in a selfish way, but also in a way that will take others into consideration. Now, this last part in chapter 5 seems to indicate a later date, but if you notice, there are basically just 5 verses in which James talks about the delayed parousia, which would indicate that he is writing much, much later when the parousia was delayed. However, when we notice that in the whole letter, there are just 5 verses which speak about the delay, we cannot make a case for a later date just because of these 5 verses. It could be possible that the fact that if he's writing in 62 already, Jesus died and rose, let us say in around 33, there are still 29 or 30 years which have passed after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So the church would have possibly been impatient also at the end of the 30 years. So these 5 verses in which he talks about enduring patiently even though the coming of the Lord is delayed need not prompt us to make a case for a later date. Finally, in the letter, the 6th part are what we call concluding exhortations. And in these letters, almost taking verbatim from the Gospel of Matthew, there is the prohibition of oaths. No swearing either by heaven or by earth, letting your yes be yes and your no be no. And then he talks about prayer and healing. This is an indication of how the first Christian community lived. The first Christian community was a community in which there was a communion, that the health of my brother or sister affected me. And finally, at the end of the letter, he gives a summons to action. This structure, with a few changes which I have made, is taken from Douglas Moo, from the 1985 book, which I did not quote in the bibliography, because after that Douglas Moo has written 2000 edition and 2007 edition. So I request you to go to that 85 one. So this is where you can find the structure of this particular one. I made a few changes in the structure in keeping with what we can talk about today. We move on now, brothers and sisters, to the exegesis or the interpretation. When you look at these verses, I will follow, as I said, exactly the structure which I proposed. I've also put down for your reference, if you have the text with you, the NRSV, which you possibly will have, you can keep it open, or you can see the text on the screen, because some of you might be doing it together. You can refer, for example, to the text, but others might not have the facility. Some may be doing it on their phone, and that is why, to make it easy for you, I've also put the text on the screen so you can see the words and the verse that we are referring to. The letter of James begins with address and a greeting. Now, James, the Greek, as I said, Jakobos. Sometimes I have used the Greek term, but if you look on the right of the first line, which begins with chapter 1, verse 1, I have also transliterated the Greek text. Now notice, brothers, for your information, there is no J in Greek. But if you look at the yod, if you look at the side of the word James in English, in yellow, look at the first alphabet, Ya, I, it's Ya. Why? Because the yod is moving from the right to the left. So when the yod is moving from the right to the left, you pronounce the word as Ya or J, Jacobos. That is basically what it is, if you notice. And A, alpha, K is kappa, O. Now notice the word O. O, there are two O's. One is omicron and the other is omega. O here is omega. If you look on the extreme right of that line, you'll find the alphabet O in English. And on top of O is a line that indicates, when you're reading that, you will know it is omega and not omicron. However, look at the side of B. Look at the side of B. You will notice another O. Now that O is omicron. So this is how the transliteration is done. So if you look on the extreme right at the word Jacobos, as I have transliterated from the Greek into English, you will see that it is J, A, K, O is omega, B is beta, O is omicron, and S is sigma. There are some which fit in properly. There is no, for example, eta is a long E and epsilon is the short E. When you're translating eta, again we put a line. So there are basically two alphabets of the Greek when you're transliterating into English and you're writing E, for example, and you see a line on top of E. For example, when you see the word amen, there is alpha, there is mu, and there is D. B, basically E is eta. And so when you put the word A-M-E, you will put above the E, you will put a line to indicate it is eta and not epsilon. So Jacobos is the Greek form of the name Jacob, which we translate into English as James. Most of the Protestant scholars will have no problem with regarding James and Joseph and Simon and Jude as the real brothers of Jesus. They would believe that Mary and Joseph came together after the birth of Jesus and they had other children. Many, not all, Catholic scholars would regard it more as the cousin, because they refer to the person who may be a brother or a sister, but also could be the cousin brother. That was the way of talking. Even today in many cultures, when we talk about brothers and sisters, we do not only mean our blood brothers and sisters, those who have come from the womb of the same mother. We might even mean cousins who have come from the womb of the mother's sister or the father's sister, and so on. Now, this James identifies himself as a servant. The reason why I put the word slave is because if you look at the English text, on top, right on top of the screen, you will notice that there is an A, the alphabet A. The alphabet A will indicate that other ancient authorities read slave, or that the translation of the Greek word doulos can be either servant or slave. So therefore, that's why I put that down, and that's what the new RSV, the translation you see, brothers and sisters, on your screen is from the new RSV anglicized version. So some words may not be as you have it in your NRSV, because this is the anglicized version. Very clearly you will notice that if the word labor appears, it will be spelled as L-A-B-O-U-R and not L-A-B-O-R as in the NRSV. So what is the meaning of servant, or what is the meaning of slave? That means this person has dedicated, given his life to God, and also all authority is that of God. He will submit to the authority of God. As a matter of fact, in chapter 14 of the Gospel of Mark, verses 35 following, we read when Jesus prays in Gethsemane, the posture that he adopts is he throws himself on the ground. The throwing himself on the ground is an indication of the fact that he wants to be disponible. He wants to be available to the Lord. He is the Lord's slave. He is the Lord's servant. And also that he is willing to accept whatever the Lord will decide. So when James uses the term servant or slave, that is the doulos of God, he signifies that he is willing to do whatever God will command him. However, in this context of the letter, it also suggests that he has the power to call himself a slave of God, to call himself someone whom God has chosen to be his slave. And that's why it suggests authority and leadership. This place is the only place in the New Testament where the author uses both God and Jesus Christ. So placing Jesus Christ on the same level as God, as we remember, Thomas did when we celebrated the feast of St. Thomas. The highest acclamation for Jesus anywhere in the New Testament is found on the lips of Thomas when he addresses Jesus as my Lord and my God. So this is something similar to that. Now, what does James mean when he speaks about the 12 tribes in dispersion? First of all, the number 12. We know from the 12 tribes of Israel to the 12 disciples that 12 is a very, very important figure in Scripture. 12 in this context seems to refer to everyone who is chosen by God, everyone who is chosen by the Lord, everyone who listens to the summons or the invitation of the Lord. The 12 basically in the Old Testament, the 12 tribes are the ones chosen by God to be that contrast community. In the New Testament, the 12 listen to the summons and respond. So both ideas are present here. It is those who are chosen by God in Jesus and also those who have responded to the invitation. There are some, as we notice, who were called, like the rich man in the Gospel of Mark was called, but who did not respond. There were some, like the Gerasene demoniac in Mark chapter 5, verse 19 and 20, who wants to be a disciple, but is not accepted and given another ministry. Here, 12 refers to both ideas. First, that these individuals are chosen by God. It does not necessarily mean there are 12 cities whom James is referring to. No, it means people spread out, basically to identify that they are the ones chosen and also they are the ones who have responded, even though they are in dispersion. And already here, my brothers and sisters, this word diaspora shows how we can be united. You and I are physically distanced because of the pandemic. You and I are physically away from each other. So the diaspora term is exactly what James is saying. That just because we are physically distant does not mean we need to be also spiritually distant. Does not mean that we need to be spiritually apart. No, we can be scattered physically and yet we can be very, very intimate as far as spiritual matters are concerned. The texts of Matthew and Revelation basically refer to the 12 tribes. Matthew has got the reference to the 12 tribes of how they will receive, each of them will receive a seat. The 12 disciples will receive a seat when the judgment is taking place. So therefore, who does the 12 tribes refer to? There are at least 5 interpretations of this term. The first is, it refers to all Christians, both Jew and Gentile, and all Christians who are now regarded as the new Israel. In Matthew chapter 16, verses 16 to 19, the text which we read on the feast of St. Peter, we realize this is what Jesus tells Peter there. Flesh and blood had not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I say, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. So this ecclesia, this church, is the new Israel. That is basically, some say the 12 tribes in dispersion are basically the new Israel, and refers to both Jewish Christians and also Gentile Christians. Another interpretation is that James is referring to Christian Jews only because of the content of the letter. A third interpretation is that they are Christian Jews but outside Palestine, and would include not those who have not become Christian yet, They are still on the periphery. They are still on the margins. They have not yet made a commitment, and yet they are open. They are open because they are not accepted, they are not rejected Jesus as the Messiah. So this is the group whom James is referring to. Another interpretation is that James is referring to all Jews, both Christian and non-Christian Jews. As a matter of fact, in some of the texts, when he speaks to the rich, he seems to be speaking to the rich in general and not specifically to the Christian rich alone. So he wants everyone to turn to Christ. And the final interpretation is that he is referring to Jews outside Palestine. Now, this particular group, James begins by sending greetings, a very, very simple, unlike Paul, who talks about the peace and love, etc. And that is another indication that we can see that this is a general letter. It was like a letter which was to be read in different communities. So there is no specific mention of peace and love and so on, simply greetings. This is how kairein is the Greek term for greeting, and this was used in Greek letters because it seems, therefore, not so much like a spiritual letter at all. But Paul writes most of his letters, he speaks about the love of Jesus and the peace of Jesus and fellowship among the community, etc. James will do none of those things. He will simply talk about the letter as greetings. Now, brothers, this is how I'm going to bring the text down. If you look at the structure which we have proposed, you will notice that now these you cannot read so clearly, and it is intended that you are not able to read these so clearly. We have just completed the address and greetings. The second part now, and you will see more clearly now, this is the second part of our letter. What does the second part deal with? It deals with trials and it deals with the response. How will a mature Christian respond to trials? This part has 4 sections. The first is the trials are sent so that they will accomplish their purpose. God has a purpose in sending trials. God has a reason why he sends trials. And second is wisdom, prayer, and faith. The third part deals with poverty and wealth. And the fourth part with trials and temptation. Notice now, the trials which began in verse 2 are mentioned once again in verse 12, and that is why this part is seen as a section. Perismos is basically the Greek word for trial and appears in the beginning in verse 2 and also in verse 12. So that's why this is seen as an inclusion. However, if you look at the different sections A, B, C, and D, you will notice that there is no connection as such. And that is why in the first chapter, or most of the first chapter, there is no connection with all of the pericopes which will appear. And James connects one pericope with another by the use of catchwords, as we will see when we move on. So this is how I will bring the different parts to remind us of where we are. Now, as a reminder, we have just completed the address and the greeting, and we are going to move now to A within the broader section of trials and Christian maturity, that is, letting trials accomplish their purpose. So you see now, this is what I've also done. If you look that within the trials and Christian maturity, we will see how James expects the trials will accomplish their purpose and what the response of the Christian must be. So he talks about, and notice again, you notice the alphabet B. Why has B been put there by the new RSV anglicized version? Because the original or the Greek text has adelphos. Adelphos is translated into English as brothers. However, we know the new RSV and the new RSV anglicized version and many others use what we call inclusive language. Inclusive language would be that we don't make a distinction between male and female, men and women, and whenever there is only man, we use the word human. Whenever there's the word brother, we use the word brother and sisters to include everybody within what the text is talking, between everybody to whom the text seems to be talking. And so therefore, brothers and sisters is this. Whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy. Now you see that word joy is karan. In the verse 5 Once again, James will use karan to indicate that joy is being linked with joy in verse 5 of chapter 1. Now, the word brothers is used in all of these references that you see. What does it indicate? It indicates that those whom James is addressing are people who are close to his heart. The fact that he uses the same term, brothers and sisters, we can say so very often, is an indication that it is the Christian community that he is referring to, specifically seems to be in this particular letter. So once again, as I said, the greeting is very simple. There is no appreciation, for example. As a matter of fact, in the book of Revelation, when John is writing to the 7 churches, some are appreciated and praised to the skies, others are not appreciated, and so on. The letter begins in that manner in chapters 1 and 2. James does not do anything of that sort, and the reason why he does not do anything of that sort is because the content is important. You might remember I said to you that you should be happy, James says, when you're facing trials. So in other words, you must experience nothing but joy. The word pasan karan, which is translated nothing but joy and comes from kara, is basically unalloyed joy. That means your joy would not be mixed up with anything. It will be pure joy. It will be complete joy. There will be no other thing that you experience. And these trials can be of any kind. Brothers, today they can refer to the trial of the pandemic. Today they can refer to the trial of the death of a loved one. Today they can refer to the trial of losing a job, of not having enough to eat. So you notice, he's telling us today, and that's why the letter is so relevant today. He's telling us today that when we experience these trials, we need to be joyful. Why do we need to be joyful? Because the trial is sent to test your faith. And when your faith is tested, then it will lead to endurance. So the more trials you go through, the more challenges you go through, the stronger you become. And once you have become strong, then you become mature. You know now how to face death. You know how to face poverty. You know how to face challenges. You know how to face whatever will come your way. And so therefore you become complete in every way. And the Lord's work will be completed in you. The Lord wants you to be that person who can withstand whatever comes your way. And this is basically the reason why trials are